Thank you so much, John, and good evening to everyone watching both through Zoom or through one of our streaming platforms. Very excited to be introducing the fifth of our series of workshops, Home Safe Home workshops that have been going on for the last few months, and so glad so many of you are able to join us today. Tonight's presentation is about keeping it looking good, your historic home, very focused on things like maintenance and repairs. They'll also be getting into issues related to things like incentives. I have to admit, living in a home that just turned 100 years old last year, I am very intrigued by this particular workshop. I'm only sorry that I can't join you for this whole workshop, but I will definitely be back to watch it at a later date, because I'm sure that I can learn a lot from the content of this workshop. Looking at the slide deck, I think all of you who are watching are going to find it a very informative and useful workshop as you go to work on your own homes or other people's homes. So excited to be bringing this to you, and I hope all of you get a lot out of this workshop. So with that, I will turn it over to your first presenter, who will be John Lesak. John, take it away.
Thank you. So next slide. So my name is John Lesak. I'm a principal and historic architect with Page and Turnbull. Also joining me is my colleague Sarah Brummett, and Sarah's director of our Preservation Technology Studio. Our Preservation Technology Studio actually specializes in doing conditions assessments and designing maintenance and repair treatments for historic buildings, including historic homes. Sarah, could you go back a slide or two? There you go. There you go. So keeping it looking great is our fifth in a series of 6 workshops, and the workshops focus on seismic safety and rehabilitating historic homes. The first 2 workshops back in June and July, time flies, focused on how to identify historic properties, as well as guidance for repair and maintenance. And they provided some of the general background about historic buildings that built up to the next 2 workshops, which were related to structural retrofit. So workshop 3 focused on seismic retrofit basics, so kind of general information. And then workshop 4 talked about retrofit projects in more specific detail and strategies for how to retrofit your home. And then today we're really going to talk more about maintenance and repair of historic homes. So, and there'll be one more, a little bit more nuts and bolts focused on December 15th. So projects I like to tell my staff and everybody I can get my hands on, you know, projects involving historic buildings really require collaboration and multidisciplinary efforts. And this series emphasizes that with multidisciplinary contributions from architectural historians, historic preservation architects, building material conservators, and structural engineers. So in addition to the California Office of Historic Preservation, our partners in this effort include structural engineers from Structural Focus and Mel Green Associates, as well as the California Preservation Foundation, who is running this Zoom webinar. So next slide. So our objectives for today is really taking pride in your historic home and keeping it looking great. So with that, you will learn why historic home maintenance is critically important, how to differentiate between maintenance, repair, and replacement, considerations in prioritizing, scheduling, and budgeting projects, aspects of cyclical maintenance for roofs, windows, finishes, and unique elements of historic homes, and then we'll touch upon some financing and funding tools that are available to homeowners. So our agenda for today, we're going to do a quick recap of workshop number 4. Then we'll get into the importance of maintenance, focusing on, well, taking a look at, is it maintenance, is it repair, is it replacement? And then maintenance is cyclical, so there's certain aspects of that that are special to think about. After that, we'll look at project priorities, prioritizing different efforts, some scheduling and budgeting tools. And then, like I said, financing and funding, and then we'll stop periodically for questions in between. So with that, we'd like to know a little bit more about our audience. So we're going to start a questionnaire. Sarah, do you want to read the questions for us?
Sure, I'd be happy to. So the first one is, in what region do you live? We have some options here. Yeah. Thank you, John. All right, so it looks like we have a few from Northwestern California and the Eureka area, some from Sierra Nevada and Lake Tahoe, majority from the San Francisco Bay Area, and also several from Los Angeles. All right, our second question is whether you attended workshop 4 or any of our previous workshops in this series. Great. Looks like a majority of folks are returning. So we're really happy that you've continued to join us and hope that you're getting a lot out of this series. All right. Our next question is, in what capacity are you interested in this topic? All right. Looks like we have a majority of homeowners with us this time, which is great. I think past workshops have had a slightly different mix, so really happy that so many of you are with us. We also have some architects, urban planners, and other. And finally, we'd love to know if you have any specific maintenance concerns for your home. All right. So it looks like we have a lot of interest in roofs, gutters, downspouts, windows and doors, and wood siding, with also interest in some of the other topics like chimneys, brick and stone, stucco, and stairs and railings. So interest in all of the above, which is great. So we will touch on all of that in some capacity throughout this presentation and invite your questions if you have other specific ones as we go along. All right, back to you, John.
Yeah, so we're going to start our workshop with a recap of the previous workshop. Next slide. So, when really thinking about approaches to retrofitting your house from a structural or seismic standpoint. We covered several things. The first thing is really to take a good look at your house and evaluate your house, understand how it performs. We covered some retrofit strategies as well as retrofit techniques and examples, and then touched upon priorities and phasing. And every little bit can help when it comes to earthquakes in California. Next. So the first step is really taking a look at your house and thinking about it. And the first step is looking at the building layout. It's kind of the shape of your house. So is it a simple box type structure like shown to the right? Does it have lots of corners and projections? And are there any special open front areas where you may have more glass or doors or garage doors that may cause an irregularity when an earthquake hits? The next, and this is shown in the illustrations to the right, is thinking about your load path. So there's effectively two. There's gravity or vertical load path, which is shown in the upper right. And it's basically how the weight of all the pieces, parts of the building get transferred down to the earth. And then there's a vertical load path. And this relates to earthquakes, could relate to winds or floods as well. But if a force pushes on your building from the side, how does the building resist that? In the illustration at the bottom right, you can see, forces coming in, and again, that could be seismic ground motion, and then shows the roof and the walls and how they may behave in an earthquake. So once you understand kind of the shape and the load path, we start to look at connections. So the critical ones are roof to wall and wall to foundation or the ground. And then there may be some special projecting elements of a house, like a chimney or like a porch, front porch, which may change some of those load paths or affect some of those load paths or act independently of the rest of the house. And then lastly, you may have some equipment. Most commonly, people think about water heaters because of the risk of a gas pipe breaking or even a water pipe breaking. But there's other pieces of equipment and furnishings that need to be connected to the rest of the building so that they can resist an earthquake load. Next slide. So there are a variety of retrofit strategies that, and we really think about it in a couple different ways, but the two basic are, can we enhance the performance of existing elements? So existing walls or the existing roof. Sometimes that may be difficult and we need to add supplemental elements. Frequently, if we're working with an adobe structure, we may need to create what we would consider a buttress to help the wall from falling over in an earthquake. Then we need to improve the connections. Shown in the diagram to the right is an engineered shear wall. And at the bottom, you can see bolts that would hold what they call hold downs, which would be connected to the foundation. And then plywood would be added and nailed at a very tight or close spacing to either existing wood framing or new wood framing, again, in order to resist those lateral loads. And then again, there's weak links. So you may have a weak connection at the roof, or your chimney may not be well connected to the rest of the building. And we want to make sure those are addressed in a retrofit project or a series of retrofit projects. Next. And then we gave some examples of retrofit techniques, starting at the top with roof sheathing. We talked about collectors. Collectors are a way to effectively grab the force of something moving laterally and tie it back into other pieces of the building. Frequently, collectors are used to retrofit a chimney, or they may tie kind of strange shaped pieces of a rambling building together. Next is shear walls. So in most California homes, these would be plywood covered walls that would resist the lateral loads. And if you look at the upper right, you can see a piece of plywood that's connected to wood studs. And there is also a sill plate with a bunch of square metal plates and bolts. Those are connecting that wall down into the foundation, which is the last element. And if you look at the lower right hand, this is showing a cripple wall, what they call cripple walls. So that's the connector from the ground, from the foundation up to an elevated first floor. So in this case, you walk up a couple steps to get to the first floor, and in between the foundation and the first floor is a cripple wall. And to the right, you can see plywood installed. If you look closely, you can also see some of those foundation anchors that we were talking about. Next slide. So, you know, in considering priorities and phasing, you really need to kind of stand back and review all the needs and prioritize what are the priorities for my house and its construction type. So if we go back and look, there's some ranking retrofit measures. So for the wood frame structures, cripple wall bracing would probably be the first one, just because the cripple walls frequently collapse in earthquakes. And we've seen that, for example, in San Francisco, with some of the Victorian homes. We want to make sure that the structure is tied to the foundation, so anchor bolts. We want to address kind of long, narrow houses with open fronts. Again, the houses in San Francisco I was talking about is kind of a classic. We want to make sure that porches are well connected, and if there are any potential items that may fall from the building, then we want to look at shear walls and chimneys. For masonry structures, frequently parapets, which are where the wall extends above the roof line. Those can frequently fall in earthquakes, particularly if it's an unreinforced masonry structure. And then gables, so that's the triangular part of the house where the roof hits the wall. And sometimes those aren't properly attached with masonry structures, and that just that piece can topple over. Again, falling hazards, there may be some brick or stone that's not well secured that could fall. Out of plane wall anchors and chimneys. So I talked about buttressing before, an adobe, that's out of plane. Diaphragm capacity, so that would be the floor or the roof, and its ability to transfer loads from different walls. Individual wall stability, so there's something called a height to thickness ratio. So the thicker and shorter walls are a lot less likely to topple over in an earthquake than tall, thin walls. And then what they call in-plane shear. So this is where the walls themselves get overloaded in an earthquake in the long direction that they're running, and they can crack and spall. So every little thing helps make your house safer. So don't think of this as, oh, the project's so small, it's not going to do anything. Next slide. So with that, we'll start to move into maintenance. And let's go to the first slide. So, why maintain? So one reason is when we don't take care of our buildings, they can become dangerous. Pieces may fall off, or people may lean on something and it may collapse, or a step may collapse under your weight and you could fall. So that's the primary reason. But there are financial reasons. You can have a higher resale value. Well-maintained homes sell for more money. You will spend less on repairs of things that are when the maintenance is deferred. And curb appeal, the pride of ownership that we talked about at the beginning. To the right, we show a graph and how on the left vertical is quantity and quality, and on the right is time. And as you do cyclical maintenance, you extend what we call the service life of a building or building parts. With that, I'll turn it over to Sarah, and she's going to talk about a little recap from workshop 2.
Thank you, John. So when we look at what makes a home historic and are considering the things that we are trying to maintain when we talk about maintaining our buildings, the first thing we look at is the historic context. So what is the historic time period in which it was built? What are the events that happened that potentially make this home historic? A lot of times with the homes that we're dealing with, if there isn't a specific person or event that's associated with this house, we're looking at something that is significant because it's a particularly good example of its architectural style. And it may be a contributor to an historic district that has a number of resources that are representative of that style. And those all then contribute to that significance. So why is this building significant? And in looking at its significance, one of the, as I said, there are those different criteria that we look at. But then once we're talking about the individual aspects of the significance that we're wanting to maintain, we're also looking at the integrity of all of the material features that communicate that significance. So if a building is significant because of its architectural style, then we're looking at those features like the fenestration, the windows, the doors, the trim details, the massing of it. What are these qualities that are going to communicate why that building is significant for its architecture? And when we're talking about maintenance, we're particularly focused on integrity. And in this case, we're talking about specifically the integrity of these features that communicate the significance. We're not necessarily talking about integrity in terms of the condition of the material. So there are 7 aspects of integrity that are part of the evaluation for both the National Register of Historic Places and the California Register, and a lot of the local registers kind of all look at these 7 aspects. And it's important in determining whether a home is historic to say, what is the historic context? What is the significance? And then does it have enough integrity to communicate that? And so we look at the integrity of each of these aspects. The first is materials, then we're looking at the design, the feeling, the location, the association, the workmanship, and the setting. And within maintenance, we're in particular looking at the integrity of the materials, the design, the feeling, and the workmanship, and maintaining and preserving those aspects of integrity. Materials is a pretty obvious factor, that's the physical part of your building. It's the siding, it's the windows, it's the doors. Design, again, that one we're a little bit more familiar with. That's looking at the overall design of the structure, the relationship between parts, its style. Feeling is a little fuzzier to understand, but that is, what are those aspects that are communicating its place in time? And then with workmanship, this is the specific craft that we see when we're talking about the original materials of an historic structure. So this is particularly the case if you have things like masonry and wood that were built by hand, that were formed by hand, possibly, carved by hand, if you have wood trim and ornament. So those are the places where we actually see the craft of the people who built the home. And again, when we're looking at maintaining these, we talk about the original materials. You have something unique like this timber lintel. In this, I think, John, this is an adobe structure, is that correct?
Correct.
Yes. And then we have this little bungalow design that has this very nice massing to it. The feeling with this is, these materials and these shapes are very much tying it to that mid-century modern. This is an Eichler home, and you just kind of immediately associate it with that period. It has a vibe to it. And then with workmanship, you have things like this carved ornament up here on this turret, as well as these unique mullion details on these windows. So these are just some examples of the aspects of each of these aspects of integrity that we are trying to maintain when we talk about maintaining our historic homes.
So an important note about integrity. So condition is not the same as historic integrity. So something can be in terrible condition and have great historic integrity, meaning that it has all those aspects that Sarah outlined remaining, but it's in poor condition. And vice versa. So you might have a building that's in great condition, but everything was replaced, nothing's original, things have been changed a little bit. So it's important to try to remember to keep those things separated. So we always are looking at condition, but it doesn't necessarily relate to the historic status of the building. So when we are thinking about the right way to treat a historic building, we look at things called character defining features. So basically, they're taking what Sarah was talking about and rolling it up into those tangible pieces that you can see and touch. So they're the elements or architectural components which establish the visual character of your home. They are parts of both the exterior and interior, and those are the things that we want to retain and preserve and maintain. Next slide. Do we want to pause and see if anybody has any questions?
Sure.
I don't see any.
Give it a moment. Yeah, I don't see any in the Q&A, but feel free to pop them in. Great.
Okay.
Great. Thank you, John. Do we have anything else? Doesn't look like it, so we will move on.
The primary guidance for how to treat a historic building is laid out through the National Park Service with the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines. So the standards are a set of principles, and there are 4 fundamental treatments that exist. So they are, and we'll go through them in a second, but there's preservation, which is basically taking measures to keep something the way it is currently. There is restoration, which is looking at that, what we call the period of significance. So the time period where the building in building ties to the historic context. So a property is significant within a historic context, and that context has a time period. So you're going to take measures to take the building back so that it effectively looks and feels the way it did during that time period. That's restoration. Rehabilitation is evolution of the building for either contemporary use or a new use with a set of standards and guidelines that guide that. And then reconstruction, sometimes historic properties are lost for one reason or another, and there's guidance established to bring those forward. And the standards are a set of 8 or more principles that overarchingly provide this framework, and then the guidelines break down by building component and give recommended or not recommended measures for treating the building.
All right, thank you, John. And because reconstruction is something we do once the structure has been lost, since we're focused on maintenance today, we're not going to touch on reconstruction, but you can definitely refer to the Secretary's standards if you have, any curiosity about that. But building on what John said about preservation, this is the process of applying measures to sustain the existing form, integrity, like we talked about earlier, and materials of the historic property. Obviously, the materials are part of that integrity. But particularly as a homeowner, this is the context in which, these standards are really helpful if you're not trying to do any additions or major renovations, but these are going to be a great place to start for teaching you how to protect and stabilize the materials of your home and the components of your home. It really focuses on that ongoing maintenance and repair and those cycles and the best practices for doing that. As I said, new exterior additions are not within the scope of this one, but it does include guidelines and standards for limited upgrading of mechanical, electrical, and plumbing systems, as well as structural systems. So as we talked about in workshops number 3 and 4, seismic upgrades can be part of preservation work that you're doing for your historic home.
So as I mentioned, restoration is really the process of accurately depicting a building and property as it appeared in a specific time period. And frequently that requires removal of what we would call inappropriate alterations or even appropriate alterations, and reconstruction of missing features from that time period. So when you're doing a restoration, you really need to have good documentation of what the building appeared like at that time. And it's hard to do a restoration without good pictures and drawings and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Like preservation, restoration allows for kind of limited and sensitive upgrades, and like preservation, some structural retrofit, seismic retrofit strategies and measures can be included in a restoration project.
All right, and finally, we have rehabilitation, which, as John said earlier, is the process of making a compatible use or upgrading an existing building for a continued use in the same use or in a new use. Sometimes historic homes become offices or community centers or things like that. As homeowners, that might not be what you're doing with your home, but homes can serve a variety of functions. Often rehabilitation is the most commonly used treatment because it has kind of the broadest range of flexibility in treatments and guidance and guidelines. But even if that overall treatment is how, what you decide is most appropriate for your property, aspects of preservation, restoration, or reconstruction might inform your approach to rehabilitation. So you can definitely have rehabilitation projects that have more of a restoration approach with how they treat certain materials or features that have been lost, etc. All right. And then building on that, as we've mentioned, there are guidelines with each of these treatments with the Secretary of the Interior standards, and they have a tremendous amount of very specific guidance starting from the site all the way down to systems for things that they recommend doing for your historic building or things that they don't recommend doing. So that can be really helpful for understanding the breakdown of what to do and what not to do and why. And I think that why is really helpful for understanding how to approach your project. Also, the National Park Service has a number of preservation briefs that are excellent resources with very specific guidance for the maintenance and repair of a number of common building materials and components. They have preservation briefs like this one that we referenced for this presentation on maintaining the exteriors of small and medium-sized historic buildings that really is focused a lot on historic homes and all of the aspects of the exterior envelope of your building. But there are also even more specific ones on the repair and maintenance of wood windows and siding and repointing historic masonry. So they're phenomenal resources and we highly recommend them. They're all publicly available.
So, selecting appropriate treatments can candidly be a little bit challenging at times. So from the place of big treatments, we're going to focus in on preservation and rehabilitation because we're talking primarily about maintenance today. But it's really important to understand, the historic significance and integrity of your property. What makes your house historic? What is the context? What is the significance? There are different criteria of significance, and if the property is tied to a specific event, it may not be as important to keep certain features. Whereas if it's tied to, it's the work of a master architect and it's all about design, it becomes very important to keep those tangible features. So that's helpful in kind of thinking about treatments, and then really taking the time to look through and figure out what are those character defining features, and using photographs and drawings, just create a list, look carefully at them. Some things may be original, some things maybe not. And we've given a treatment hierarchy flowchart. So on the left-hand side is if it is an original feature or material or character defining feature. First, we want to identify it. Second, we want to maintain it. At some point, you'll need to do some repair. It's preferable to retain and repair things as a priority. Frequently, people make the mistake of just jumping to replacing things that could be repaired or partially replaced, but not fully replaced. If it can be repaired, you want to, or if it cannot be repaired, you want to replace individual features and pieces to match the aesthetic quality of the original and preferably the materials of the original. And then lastly, if you are going to do some alterations, meaning you're going to put an addition on the building or something like that, you need to be cognizant of the building's original character. And then on the right-hand side, if a component is altered or a non-original feature, You can consider restoring it to the original. Again, you need to have that documentation so you know what it looked like originally. And then if you decide just to replace it with something non-original, make sure it's compatible. And then on the lower left, we just show an example of all the pieces, parts, a colonial roof gable. This is a broken gable, and carefully going through and looking at the entablature, which is the lower part, the box eave, which comes and turns the corner, even though functionally it doesn't need to. It's an aesthetic move, and then all the various pieces of the rake, which is the edge of the gable, labeled by 3B. Next. So when we're starting to look at our buildings and trying to select a appropriate treatment, it's helpful to have a checklist, and we give an example of that over to the right, but we start with just some fundamental questions. Is it safe? If it's not safe, can it be stabilized so that you have some time to figure out what to do? One of the things about conditions assessment is you have to define what failure means. When does a building component need to be replaced? And there's lots and lots of different reasons for that. But it's good to go through a process of saying, hey, can I retain this? Can I fix this? Are there some opportunities for that? Then can it be repaired? Which is a little more intensive than just doing maintenance. So I show a door threshold at the lower right. You can see a big chunk of it's missing by the fellow's shoe, and that's a safety hazard, right? It's not even. You could catch it funny and trip. So that's the type of thing that you want to address sooner rather than later. And we'll talk more about that as we go through. And then we like to use a very simple good, fair, poor mechanism for looking at the components of a building. And we find that those definitions may vary a little bit, but I think your house, and you can make those judgments as well as anybody. And then based on that, we take some notes and take some pictures, but we frequently try to define a project. So is it something that can be maintained? Ongoing maintenance is OM. And then RP is a repair. It's a project. It needs repair. It may need a specialty contractor. It may need somebody with special skills in order to repair. Next slide. And then we'll get into this in a minute, but in planning these things, is it maintenance? And Sarah will talk about this. Is it repair? Is it a replacement? If it is maintenance, when will it occur? How often will it need to occur? Are there seasonal factors? For example, you don't want to do roof work in the winter in Southern California because that's when it rains. I started my practice in Chicago, so lots of things didn't happen in the winter. There may be use factors. You may be throwing a party in 3 weeks, so that may not be the best time to do these things. Trying to figure out a cost. Some things may have to wait because we can't afford them. And then can we leverage certain treatments with others? So frequently when you're doing a seismic retrofit, for example, you open up the wall, it's an opportunity to fix some waterproofing, add some insulation, maybe address some electrical wiring. So combining all those things in the long run will save time and save money.
All right. So in drilling down a little bit more on the differences between maintenance, repair, and replacement, the big thing is maintenance is proactive. Maintenance and cyclical maintenance are the activities that will allow you to help preserve the integrity of your home and extend the life cycle of all of the materials and systems. So if you, for example, you can see here on the upper right, we have windows that are in a reasonable state of repair. The paint's in relatively good condition, the glazing's in relatively good condition, and there's paint on the siding, the trim, and those features, if that paint and glazing and all of that is maintained, should have a longer treatment life than life of the material than if the paint is allowed to deteriorate and degrade. Then, and we'll get into this more when we get to the environmental impacts that interact with this, but you'll get more water into the wood. All of these materials on this building on the upper right are wood. You'll get more UV exposure, and that will all contribute to faster deterioration of those materials, so that then instead of just cyclical repainting, you might be dealing with partial replacement or repair of these items that will be more complicated and more costly. Similarly, on the lower right, we have biological buildup in a gutter. Something as simple as cleaning out your gutters regularly, which again, we'll talk about more in the cyclical maintenance, but making sure that you have proper drainage around your building and at your roof will prevent leaks from building up and will just overall protect the integrity of your home. When we do rise to the level of needing some kind of repair, this can be necessary just because of some acute event that happened. There might have been a storm or an earthquake, and damage happens. It just happens. So we certainly understand that there's, and not that there's any shame in deferred maintenance, that happens too. But deferred maintenance is one of those things that, as we've said earlier, can increase the cost of what you need to do. So this railing, for example, was in very poor repair. It hadn't been painted in over 20 years and had really significant environmental exposure. And so you can see how the paint has peeled off in places. There's rot at the bottom of it where the fastener is connected to that lower rail. There's biological growth that has colonized the wood. So there's a lot of repair work that needs to happen to this particular railing in order to rehabilitate it and restore it. And frankly, there were other things going on with this railing as well, but it's still a good example of, you know, things that need to be repaired because they haven't been maintained. These repairs should always be done sensitively, again, referring back to the Secretary's standards and the preservation briefs for guidance about how to approach repairs. You want to be doing it with compatible materials and to preserve as much of the historic fabric as possible. So it's particularly important to make sure, in a way, you know, you kind of think of the Hippocratic Oath almost, do no harm. You don't want to be doing a repair that, for example, is going to introduce a non-breathable coating to something like wood or masonry and potentially trap moisture inside and then drive deterioration down the road. So you want to be really careful if you're using any contemporary materials that they're compatible with whatever your historic materials you're working with. And then when it comes to replacement, again, sometimes this is necessary. At this particular house, yeah, you can see the heritage oak trees behind the building. They have a really significant acorn woodpecker problem, and they had these beautiful redwood gutter boxes that trimmed out the copper gutters, and the acorn woodpeckers decided that this was their favorite granary, and they had just completely destroyed that top curved portion of this trim on the gutters. And so in several locations around the building, these had to be replaced in kind. And so you can see here, they've used high grade redwood, they've turned them so that they match the existing perfectly, and did a really, really beautiful job of replacing these in kind. Sometimes using the in-kind material is not possible, and sometimes it's not even appropriate. So you may know that old growth redwood is sometimes more durable, or it is more durable than a lot of new growth redwood. So you might work with what the local products are to figure out, especially if it's going to be coated, if that in-kind replacement is necessary, or if there's a compatible material that is going to be equally or potentially even more durable. So things like whether it's going to be coated, if it's going to be left exposed, that'll also help you decide kind of what materials are best suited to that replacement. All right, and now we have a little quiz for you. We're going to be looking at whether something is a maintenance versus repair versus replacement. So on this first one, and these will all be windows. So let us know whether you think this is maintenance, repair, or replacement. All right. This one is a little bit of a trick question for everyone who says maintenance. You are partially right. Repair is slightly more correct on this one. There's definitely maintenance to be done, but the joints on this bottom rail are open. And so this window will require a little bit of repair work to tighten that back up and make this watertight again. That goes a little bit beyond just general maintenance. But obviously maintenance is required as well. So on this next one, do you think maintenance, repair, or replacement? All right. This one, the answer is actually maintenance. You'll notice the joints on this are tight. We have some issues with the glazing here, but replacing glazing falls under routine maintenance for this type of wood window. And otherwise, we have a lot of paint deterioration that needs to be prepped, primed, and repainted. But otherwise, this glazing actually and the glass just needs to be cleaned, and this can just be maintained. So it's definitely a little heavier maintenance, but it's actually in pretty good shape, even though it looks pretty nasty because the paint's in such bad shape. All right, and finally we have this one. I think this is maintenance, repair, or replacement. And replacement and repair are technically both correct. The upper sash is in a condition that it can be repaired and rehabilitated, but the lower sash is missing entirely. So it will be replaced in kind using the upper sash as a model. So as you can see, it can be a little tricky. It's a little bit of a judgment call. This one, obviously, the lower sash needs to be replaced. All right. Moving on to aspects of cyclical maintenance. I'll pass it back over to John.
Thank you. So one of the things that it's critical to think about is what I call the service environment. So what are the environs that your building and your building components are operating under. So one of the wonderful things about California is we have lots and lots of different regional climates. And that means we need to think about buildings in different ways, whether they're at the beach, in the high desert, or in an urban environment. Each of these pieces and places has a different set of punishing factors that they will inflict upon your building. And even, different cardinal orientations. So the north of a building is going to see different weathering than the south of a building, the east of a building, and the west of a building, particularly depending on kind of solar orientation, prevailing winds, amounts of rain, so on and so forth. Slide. So here's a map that's available that really shows all the different climates of California, and we have a desert, we have a more cool interior away from the coast climate, we have a highland or timberland climate, semi-arid and Mediterranean, like my climate down here in the Los Angeles area. Next. And same with rainfall. So we always talk about drought, at least where I live, but even parts of Northern California get a fair amount of rain on an annual basis, and mountain areas get a fair amount of snowfall, and of course we have a good chunk of desert. So each of those is a little bit different and has to be thought about a little bit differently, particularly when you're doing cyclic planning. Next. So when we start to look at cyclic maintenance, it's helpful to keep a list or a schedule of building features that require maintenance. Sarah was talking about windows, but well, I'll talk about it in a bit in the next slide. But we can plan and budget for longer term maintenance or repair projects like a repainting or even a re-roofing. And again, repair projects may become part of the cycle. Well, let's go to the next slide. So this is a example of a cyclic maintenance plan that we've developed. And this is in a spreadsheet, so it's helpful to sort. And we're using a type of system that calls out what we call major groups. So there's the site, there's the exterior, there's the interior, and then each of those has elements. So it could be walls. On this property, we have a pool, roof, and then we do that simple, good, fair, poor. And then each of the elements can have individual components. So a wall could be masonry, it could be wood, it could be brick. And then we like to assign a priority to it. And we usually do kind of immediate. And that's if either something's unsafe or if the condition is such that if not addressed, it'll accelerate deterioration or decay of other parts of the building. So if your roof is leaking, that'll affect interior finishes as the water kind of pours into the building. And there's a little description. We try to assign a quantity because that's helpful in the cost estimating, but frequently it's just all or each. Then we develop, based on those priorities, we develop treatment cycles. So frequently we'll want somebody to address something immediately, but then you end up spreading out. So for like windows, they need to do a window restoration project that should happen in the next 5 to 10 years. And then after that, every 25 years, you could plan to do a window project. And then we assign a maintenance, is it a maintenance project? Capital project means it needs a larger investment, or is it immediate? Do you need to address it right away? And the part of that's just helping us in sorting. And then we try to assign costs to the various pieces, and then plans should be living documents, so we update them periodically, in this case on an annual basis. So we will take some factors like the consumer price index and escalate the cost as we go. So we understand in current dollar terms what those amounts might be. Next slide.
All right. So another way to look at maintenance and cyclical maintenance is to think about it in terms of categories of concerns that you might have around your building. So the 4 main ones, or there are 5. There's several that we'll talk about. The first one being plants. So the vegetation around your house can affect it in a variety of ways. If you have large trees, they need to be in good repair and health so that they're not dropping limbs on your house, they're not potentially falling over on your house. Those are things that you want to really pay attention to. So that we would recommend inspecting and trimming the vegetation around your house at least annually, possibly more often. If there have been a storm or something like that, you want to look and see that, has a tree been struck by lightning? It doesn't happen that often in California, but it's not impossible. You also definitely want to make sure that you're clearing any plant debris from around your roof, from the drainage, the gutters like we looked at earlier, the grade and foundation around your house. If you have leaves or other debris that's collected around there, it can help retain moisture and prevent proper drainage away from the foundation of your building and lead to things like rising damp and leaks. So you really want to make sure that everything around that is clear. You also want to pay attention to whether or not plants are planted too close to your house. So that could directly result in damage from scratching up against siding or other trim, things like that. Or it could just prevent you accessing that feature to properly maintain it. So some creeping vines will get into the joints, but others just prevent you from being able to properly assess the condition of the joints and make sure they stay repointed if they're climbing on masonry. So it's important to make sure that you don't have vegetation that's too close to the house that's either causing direct damage to it. Even, roots from trees going into foundations can be a problem. So thinking about things like that. And then also in California, depending on where you are, kind of everywhere, honestly, at this point, we have to think about defensible space for wildfires. And so you also want to be thinking about protecting your home from that perspective. Do you have dry vegetation around your house? Do you have tall grasses? What's the condition of your trees, your shrubs? Really think carefully about whether that is in condition and in spacing that it won't contribute fuel to potentially damaging your home if there is a wildfire.
Just I wanted to weigh in on the plants. So something that we regularly see is irrigation placed too close to homes, where
Yes.
either drip irrigation is kind of soaking either masonry, brick or stone, or even concrete, and leading to problems, or just kind of sprayers are continually soaking down parts of the house that they shouldn't. So when you're maintaining your plants, also take a look at the irrigation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, John. So another thing we want to be mindful of are pests. This can be insects, this can be animals. You want to be inspecting attics, crawl spaces, and foundations for signs of vermin infestation. You could have rats or squirrels or raccoons or bats or birds. There are all sorts of things that can get into your house. So in the lower right here, we have a hole from ground squirrels under an adobe wall. And the really dangerous thing, if you happen to have an adobe building, is that the ground squirrels can actually burrow up into the adobe and actually come up into the walls and undermine not only the base and foundation of the wall, but the structural integrity of the wall itself. So that's a really significant concern. You also want to look at wooden elements for signs of insect damage. So termites, you can see in this bracket in the upper right, there are a variety of insects that can attack the wood in your home, particularly if it's exposed, if it's gotten wet. They'll just go right in there. You also want to be inspecting chimneys for things like birds and bats, especially before the heating season. So it's best to check that at least annually. You also, and I'll get to this in a later slide, but you also want to check the parge on that. So there are different reasons we want to check chimneys and these other elements, but as far as pests go, these are definitely things to be looking out for. And attics, crawl spaces, and foundations, this is one of the most frequent things to check. You want to be checking this at least every 4 months, but possibly more often, especially if you hear something. Definitely check it out.
Hear or smell something too.
Yes. Yeah, definitely.
So I was gonna chime in on this one too. So again, plants and pests are interrelated. So plants frequently can provide a very good pathway for insects and rodents to get to higher places on your building than they normally would and find their way in. And I'll save my disgusting story for later.
Yeah, and actually that's a great point, John, because you can see here on this upper right image, I wouldn't say most of the time when we're seeing termite damage, it's usually lower on the building, or at least starting lower and working up. On this particular building, you can see here, there was ivy that had completely covered this wall of the building all the way up to the eaves. And so that was a conduit for insects getting up to parts that they wouldn't normally have gotten to on their own. Not to say that they can get all over the place, but it was a little unusual to see this high up. All right, the next concern we have is the sun. I touched on this a little bit earlier, but really, like the sun, just like we have skin that needs to be protected from the UV radiation of the sun, so does every other organic building material. So your wood, windows, doors, siding, trim, porch features, if it is not protected with a layer of paint, it will deteriorate, or flashing or something else to protect it from the UV radiation. And it's also a factor for other environmental concerns, but the paint itself really degrades significantly in the sun as well. So this is where John was mentioning you can have different cycles on different exposures of your building. So the southern and western facades of buildings, if they're exposed to significant sun and not shaded, by an adjacent building or something like that, are very susceptible to a faster rate of deterioration of those coatings and then those materials. So sometimes when you're thinking about the cyclical maintenance, you might even need shorter cycles for maintaining paint on historic wood on those southern and western facades. So that's just something to keep in mind, that you might not have to do every side of your building as frequently, but you really want to maintain these in good repair, because you can see here in the upper right, the wood has really deep UV damage and other deterioration associated with this failed paint, because the paint hasn't been maintained with that really strong southern exposure. And then the other thing that is other aspects that are very susceptible to UV degradation are things like plastics, sealants, anything rubber. It'll start to break down and get brittle and not perform as well over time in response to that solar exposure. So we want to be looking at any, if you have some kind of plastic flashing or a sealant around windows or weather stripping that is, rubber, that you want to be looking at that if it's exposed to the sun and replacing it as necessary so that you don't get leaks through those features.
The same,
Yeah.
the same applies to many roofing materials, particularly
Yes.
asphalt-based roofing materials.
Yeah. Like I said, speaking of leaks, water is another major concern for our buildings. It can cause all sorts of problems. So it's best to inspect your gutters and downspouts at least twice per year. Generally, kind of before and after the rainy seasons in California is a good rule. Before the rainy season, you want to make sure that it's clear. Afterward, you want to take out any debris that's gotten in there. And if there've been really big storms and you've noticed a lot of debris around your yard, it's probably a good idea to check it. And in really heavy rains, you might even check the performance of your gutters and downspouts during that event, because if something gets backed up, then it can quickly overflow. Obviously, you want to do that safely. We don't want you getting hurt during a storm. But those unusual events can sometimes lead to an overloading of the system and causing other problems. So you also want to be inspecting your foundation and grade drainage, making sure that water's flowing away from the foundation of your building. You want to be inspecting your windows, doors, roofs, attics, basements, crawl spaces, all of the above for leaks, especially during storms. It's really helpful to see if you have water coming in anywhere, just check that. You can also, in attic spaces, you can see discoloration from water getting in after a storm. So definitely be checking those aspects. On chimneys, you can have rising damp at the base that's coming from the ground and wicking up through the masonry from the bottom up, but then typically you'll also have some kind of chimney cap over the flue that's preventing water from just flowing right down into your building, but that can become damaged. It can corrode depending on what type of material it is. So you want to make sure that's in good condition. Porches, stairs, and railings can be particularly susceptible to rot and deterioration that can become a safety issue because of their connection to the grade, their exposure and projecting off the building. They might not have the same protection of the walls that might be protected by an eave and the roof. So you want to make sure that those are in good repair. And then masonry mortar can also deteriorate over time as water flows through it. And you want to just make sure that that is in good repair. And with that mortar, you also want to make sure that it is the mortar that the water is flowing through for the most part, if it's coming down through the wall. So it needs to be softer than the brick that it is, or stone that it is adhering. That is your sacrificial layer. Then we also have to think about the wind and air infiltration. So these are both, examples of areas that are really susceptible to wind because they haven't been maintained. So with this, you want to look at the weather stripping at windows and doors. With historic windows, typically weather stripping is helping prevent a draft more than it's preventing water getting in. Usually the water is going to flow down because of the way it's angled, but if you're thinking about the draftiness of the windows, that's really where the weather stripping is going to help you. So you can see if that's either non-existent, that might be something you might want to add, or if it is there, is it performing well, depending on what type, is it still completely in place? Sometimes if they're just adhesively attached, that adhesive can degrade over time and it might be hanging out of the window and not fully performing. So you want to look at that. After high wind events, for example, we have Diablo and Santa Ana winds. You might check your siding, flashing, roofing, other areas for damage or displacement. Things can become dislodged. And also this, I mentioned earlier, inspecting the mortar. From a wind perspective, this chimney on the upper right actually did blow bricks blew off of it during a high wind event because the mortar was in such bad repair that the bricks were just kind of sitting there. And it was high enough winds that they started blowing off the top of the chimney. So that is definitely not something you want to happen. You want the mortar to be in good repair and holding those bricks together. But then also thinking of how a chimney works, if we consider the hot air of the exhaust, if you actually have a fire in your fireplace or in a stove or something like that, and you have a flue that has a parge coat on it, which would be a cementitious layer, just around that interior, you want to make sure that that is in good repair as well. And this will take more of an expert to inspect. But if you have cracks in that, depending on how the chimney is attached to your building, you can start to have a fire risk from sparks getting through if that starts to fail. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. John, anything to add on the wind and air?
Just watch your roofing, particularly
Yes.
in Southern California. We get some high winds, and frequently we'll have shingles and other roofing pieces that will blow off.
Yes. Great. All right.
So we actually have a question.
Yeah.
So I think it's referring to, I think it's slide 48. So it's the windows and the sun slide. We want to go back.
Yeah.
So Andrew said that the lower photo shows a horizontal piece of wood collecting leaves. So that's actually a screen, or it was a screen. And the mesh is missing, so it's created a pocket, which is just filling up with leaves. I think one of the thing about our work in particular is we tend to look at things that are in really bad condition instead of just kind of okay condition, or at least that's what we take pictures of. So this is an example where, yes, I think you could just remove that screen piece that runs around the window and correct the details so that at least the leaves and the water would flow away. So that's that question.
Great, thank you. And if there are any other questions on this maintenance section, we will be moving on to the project priorities, scheduling, and budgeting next. So happy to stop here and answer any questions you have right now. And thank you for the note about the typo with the Santa Ana winds.
Oh, yeah.
This is what happens when you have a Virginian putting together a presentation about California winds. My apologies. All right. Jen Haber, do we have any other questions? I'm not seeing any. Okay. All right, great. And we will go ahead and move on.
So
Okay. 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 All right, great. Thank you.
So looking at project priorities, we assume that we've done some assessment. And when we do our assessments, we go into attics and crawl spaces and at least stick our head in and take a look around. So we recommend that people think in terms of first life safety. So any condition that's potentially hazardous moves to the top of the priority list. Secondly, looking at conditions that lead to accelerated decay. We talked earlier about a leak that's occurring that may damage actually wall front. It could damage wood framing. It could damage interior finishes, and it could lead to other problems that are more costly and things that happen quickly. We would typically put repairs before cyclical maintenance, and then add cyclical maintenance, and after that, kind of cosmetic other systems related improvements like heating or air conditioning. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. Then budgeting. Oh, I know what I was going to say. For cosmetic stuff, we frequently will deal with folks. We often deal with people who have been gifted a home, and it's a nonprofit group, and they always focus in on things like wallpaper. They want to save the wallpaper, the interior furnishing. In the meantime, there's bricks falling off a chimney, or there's water pouring in when it rains, and they may get a grant for the interior finishes, but spending the money on safety items and making sure that decay isn't accelerating is really the critical point of creating a plan. And then developing budgets. So budgets can be done in a couple different ways. You can work with somebody, a trained contractor, trained architect or engineer. There's lots of different publications and web apps that'll give you financial information. There's something called Blue Book. You can go to the library and look up costs of things in Blue Book. So there's a couple different ways to develop budgets. And then working to develop a schedule, and that really takes all these different pieces and puts them together. So next slide. So there's project execution, and we usually think of these as different efforts. Somebody who's particularly handy, I do a lot of the maintenance around my house myself. I'm at the point with my roof where I think I have to get somebody in. The rain last night was a little tough. You can hire a qualified contractor. We always recommend for contractors, you get someone who has experience with historic building and a track record of at least 5 years. And ideally, if it's just somebody who regularly does maintenance work, has 10 historic projects that they could show to you and get some references. Again, for repair, you could self-perform. You could hire a qualified contractor. Depending on the degree of the repair, you might want to hire a qualified designer or engineer to design the repair, and then get prices from contractors. And the same with replacement projects. And again, with designers and engineers, make sure they are experienced with historic buildings. And have a depth of knowledge beyond 1 or 2 projects. Next. And then, scheduling considerations, the contractor availability. This has been a problem. So we're in a interesting time for budgeting and executing projects. A lot of materials have supply chain issues, and there is a dearth of kind of qualified construction workers. So projects within the past, well, really since COVID started, are taking longer, one, to start, and two, to complete. So be prepared for that. There are times of the year when contractors are busier and less busy. Rainy season, roofing contractors that do roof repair always pick up because there's always a multitude of leaks and things that they're dealing with. And we talked already about material availability, but we've even seen issues getting things as simple as paint. They won't have the particular sheen you want in stock, and lead times can be 6 weeks sometimes. So it's a different animal. Next. So here's some examples of different planning documents that we've done. And in a minute, we'll talk about Mills Act. And this is an example of plans that we put together for a Mills Act project. And this is a very specific building. It's an unusual home, prefabricated. So they had wall panels, and we recommended an annual inspection and patching. Roof and gutters, again, it's in Southern California, so late summer, early fall, going through and inspecting the roof and gutter. This is critical. And then landscape, again, this is one where the trees are a little too close, and they cause some problems both for the roof and for the base of the home at the foundation. So this is actually over a 10-year span, so those costs are fairly straightforward. This home was owned by a fellow who had contractor friends, and they were able to do it at a reasonable price. Next. And then here's a example of a repair plan. This is for the same basic project. And we're looking at exteriors. So this is wall panels, paint, doors, roof, and windows. And we've got a description of what needs to be done. Again, unit cost in units, total estimated repair cost. And then we've put this out over 10 years. So you can see some of the stuff is in year 1, some of the stuff is to be done in year 3, and even one of the items is to be done in year 6. So it looks at time, cost, and various items. So budgeting for projects within historic buildings can be tricky. There are different, when you're talking about construction projects, there are lots of different pieces that fall in, and lots of different what I call multipliers. And most folks work off of a construction budget, but that's not the only piece of the budget. So there's hard costs, which are construction costs, and there's soft costs, which can be design costs. They can sometimes include permit costs. They can, in a larger project, they might include furnishings. We recommend establishing contingencies, because when you're working on a historic building, frequently you'll uncover a condition that you couldn't have planned for. I usually say a 13% contingency because that's what's been drilled into my head over the years, and experience tells me that's a pretty good number. But round that up to 15% for your projects, just so that you have some flexibility and don't get caught short. And right now we're seeing lots of, well, really for the past several years, we've seen what they call escalation. So that's another word for inflation, where prices are rising fairly rapidly year to year to year. So budgeting has been tricky the past 4 years, to be honest with you. So it might be time to pause real quick and see if there are any more questions. John, anything your way? Okay.
All right. We will move on to some of the financing and funding tools and resources. So the California Earthquake Authority's Brace and Bolt program is one we covered in more detail in workshop number 4, but it provides qualifying grants to qualifying homeowners for specifically retrofitting cripple walls. As we mentioned, that's a pretty common type in residential construction of a certain period in California. And so that's also a relatively easy fix. So this really targets that type of work. They do have the applications for 2022 open right now, and those are open through November 29th. So if you want to refer back to workshop number 4 to learn a little bit more about that program, if that's not something you've already done to your home and you want to think about doing that in terms of maintenance, you can also look at other foundation work and repairs if you have any rot at that area. But really, maintaining the structural integrity of your home is definitely part of maintenance as well. So definitely encourage you to look into that if you have cripple walls and they have not already been braced and bolted to your foundation. As John mentioned when he was showing you the maintenance schedules for work, we have the Mills Act in California, which allows individual municipalities to defray a certain amount of the property tax. So it's this property tax abatement program for homeowners, and it has to be either owner occupied or income producing properties. The term of the contract is usually for a minimum of 10 years with whatever your local municipality is. And the terms of the Mills Act contracts and the Mills Act programs can vary a lot by the municipality who's administering them. So there's a great resource on the Office of Historic Preservation's website to find your municipality, whether they participate, and then what the program is locally. In San Francisco, for example, there's a May deadline for Mills Act applications. So it's really important to understand what the schedule is and understand that because there are a number of pieces that go into the application, including this maintenance, repair, and rehabilitation plan that goes into the application, that you need some time to plan for that. And you may need to work with a professional designer with experience with Mills Act programs to help you apply for that. But the main thing is that the owner will, as part of the contract, agrees to protect, preserve, and maintain the property in accordance with the Secretary of the Interior standards. So those are those standards we've been referencing throughout this presentation, and you just want to make sure that you're familiar with that and doing everything in line with the standards, because there's also usually kind of an auditing program within that municipality to make sure that you're doing what you say you're doing in exchange for this property tax abatement. So, and these, I think, John, was this the Illumina building you were talking about earlier?
Yes.
On the top here?
Yes.
And then the lower right is a Mills Act property in Gilroy, California. There are also historic preservation easements that may be available, and that's a voluntary legal agreement to protect an historic structure. And then there's usually a federal tax deduction equal to the value of whatever rights you've given away as part of the easement to a qualified charitable organization. And John, do you have additional information about this you want to share? Or
again, these can vary a bit. Normally it's the easement is between the property owner and a charitable organization like a local historic preservation group. I've seen instances of them where they're between a municipality and a homeowner. But effectively, it's kind of like any other easement. You have electrical easements and kind of parking easements. You effectively are donating a piece of your property to a nonprofit group, and there'll be a set of agreements and who's taking care of the maintenance of the property, how are they doing it, who's monitoring it on behalf of the organization, and that can vary quite a bit from group to group to group. And then it's filed with the county that you or the properties in.
Great, thank you. And then finally, soon we will have the state historic preservation tax credit, which will allow homeowners or building owners to claim a percentage of their project expenses for repair, rehabilitation projects against their state income taxes. Unlike the federal program that is not available to homeowners, the state program will be available to homeowners. It will be administered by the Office of Historic Preservation and the California Tax Credit Allocation Committee. They are working out the exact rules of the program right now, and we expect that to be rolled out in early 2023. And John Haber, I know the California Preservation Foundation has been pretty instrumental in lobbying for this. So if you have anything else you'd like to share about this tax credit, we would love to hear from you as well. Okay. Wonderful. Great, thank you. All right, we are now on to our final summary and questions. So I will pass it back to John Lesak.
Sure. So, maintenance helps preserve the historic integrity of your home. It reduces the need for more costly repairs and replacement of materials. We found working with economists that regular maintenance also increases the value of your home. There are many things to think about when crafting maintenance programs and plans, including what I call the service environment, but the climate, the individual cardinal orientations of the home, different features of the property and the materials involved all impact cyclic maintenance. Really, prioritize work starting with safety, then to slow any additional decay. And we recommend planning things out over time and budgeting over time. And there are a series of different financing and funding tools and resources that can assist you in maintaining and repairing your home. If you want to go to the next slide. So we'll get into a little bit more detail on some of these things of the how-to in a month, so December 15th on a Thursday. We promise there won't be a federal election that night. And there was a question about the brace and bolt grants. So on the next slide, there's some additional resources and further reading. So down there, you can see there's a link to the California Earthquake Authority Brace and Bolt program, and you can go there and find out about their financing and grant program. I think they're up to $5,000 grants, as I recall. So with that, that completes our presentation for tonight. Are there any additional questions?
Sure. So there's a request that we cover lath and plaster repair and insulation in the next session. And I think we could probably work that in.
I'm dealing with it now on a project for exterior plaster, actually. So it's
Yeah.
interesting.
All right. We have a question from Ray, who lives in Eureka with a large proportion of homes that are post and pier foundations. Will we be more specific to this type in this series?
We certainly can. It's better to get our structural engineers involved with that, but I know both of them were up in Eureka following the earthquake up there. So we
And I
can take
think
a
there
look and-
was, yeah.
And
I feel like,
sorry,
Go
feel
ahead.
free to email us questions and we can
Yes.
respond outside of the presentation.
Yes, I think a similar question may have come up in workshop number 4. I don't remember if there was significant focus on it in the presentation itself, but if you look back at the recording, I think there was some discussion in the question and answer in that presentation as well. All right. Given another minute for questions. We definitely thank you all for being with us on this rainy election night. Sounds good.
Sounds good to me. I took a snip of those questions about the lath and plaster and the post and piers, so I'll add those to
Great.
internal tracking.
Thank you, John.